Greetings. We're coming to the end of this little series from Mark's Gospel, and we're closing for the time being. We're doing other things over the next few weeks. For the time being, we're finishing with Mark, but we'll be back to him, of course, at some stage. This is the final talk in my series on Mark 7 to 10. And it's the end of the passage which I've described, and some of the Bible experts decide, I don't make these things up, others have said it before me, that Jesus is doing intensive discipleship training for his disciples. And that's bracketed between two healing miracles, one only occurring in Mark's Gospel, the man at Bethsaida, who needs two touches from Jesus. The first time he sees but people looking like trees and no clarity. And then the second time is this today's passage, the story of Bartimaeus, who sees rather clearly eventually, once he's healed, but sees clearly rather than partially. And that's a deliberate image of the disciples who are learning to follow Jesus, or the apostles who are learning what it means to be disciples, followers of Jesus, and they at best they can only see vaguely, and clarity will eventually come. And all this time they're on the way or the road. It's the same word in the original, and we get different English words to translate it, which can be confusing. The way or the road, which is the way to Jerusalem and his sufferings and death and eventual resurrection, and all the rest, the gospel going out from Jerusalem. And here they finish the journey through largely a mixture of different territories. They've left Galilee, they've done a bit of Gentile territory. They're in what was then called Judea, and they're finishing in Jericho today. Now, today Jericho is in what is variously called the West Bank, or the Palestinian territories, or Palestine, or whatever. But it's the last stage on the typical journey to Jerusalem if you're going down through the river valley rather than over the mountains. You have to go up again. Jerusalem is on a hill. It's mountainous. It's 3,500 feet above Jericho, 2,500, nearly 3,000 feet above sea level. Jericho is way nearly 1,000 feet below sea level, as is the Jordan Valley, part of the Great Rift that runs further south through Africa as well. And Jericho is there, not far from the river, but only 20 miles northeast of Jerusalem, down a steep hill and a dangerous road, as we've got the story of the Good Samaritan. And it's a dangerous road through hot mountain desert territory. But if you're coming from the north, a very good way of doing it, one of the best ways of doing it nowadays, is to go along the road through the Jordan Valley and then up that steep hill, that steep road into Jerusalem, which is the way clearly Jesus was going. And not least as we read elsewhere, during his few days, his last week before his crucifixion, he's staying in and around Bethany, which is most of the way up the hill. It's at the top, near the top of the Mount of Olives. As you go up from Jericho to Jerusalem, you reach a mountain looking down on and over the city. There's one more ridge to cross, one more gulf to cross, a valley, But you look down over Jerusalem from the top of the Mount of Olives, and Bethany is just near there. Climb up all that way from Jericho and look over Jerusalem. And Jesus stayed around the top of the Mount of Olives for most of that week, with daily forays into Jerusalem, down and up a little bit, a couple of miles walk. But here he's approaching Jericho, and Jericho is the culmination of the discipleship training, though he doesn't say anything to the disciples. He doesn't need to, almost. Verse 46, they came to Jericho. It's Mark 10, 46 to 52, 46 to the end. They came to Jericho. That's interesting. Mark uses his language and his words very carefully. And if you compare one with another, you pick up meanings. In chapter 8, verse 22, they came to Bethsaida. Just like that, as a sentence. They came to Bethsaida. And that's where he's going to heal the man in 2 stages of his blindness. And here, 10 verse 46, they came to Jericho. That's a sentence too. Comparing the two, the two are there as 2 healing miracles described initially in the same way. 2 blind men being healed, 2 men being enabled to see, one rather gradually and one quite suddenly. And the blindness and partial sight of the disciples being contrasted. These 2 miracles are meant to be taken together. They're introduced in the same way for that reason. And what comes between them is obviously one section of the gospel being bookended, I would say, by those 2 miracles. But this miracle of Bartimaeus is just a bit different from the other miracles. They're all different from each other, and the differences are worth looking at. This is the last healing miracle recorded in the Gospels. He's finished his ministry of that sort. The next story will be Jesus entering Jerusalem on what we call Palm Sunday. Which is why this is a good point to finish the story. He's finished his Galilee ministry, he's finished his Gentile ministry, he's finished his discipleship training, and we're about to enter Jerusalem for what we call Holy Week, the last week of Jesus' life before the cross. And the last place they go before entering Jerusalem is Jericho. His disciples and a large crowd were leaving Jericho. They've been there, they've stayed the night, had a meal, whatever, and they're leaving Jericho. That means they're on the final stage of the walk to Jerusalem. One day's hard walking up a hill in the heat. They were leaving Jericho. Bartimaeus, son of Timaeus, that's Mark, who writes often for Gentile readers more than for Jewish readers. Mark explains what Bartimaeus means. Jews, of course, knew perfectly well. But for Gentiles, Bartimaeus, son of Timaeus, a blind beggar, was sitting by the roadside. Of all the healing miracles, this is the only one where we know the name of the person healed. That's significant, isn't it? It sticks in the mind. Bartimaeus and his healing is a bit special. We're to know his name. That is important because there's something about this particular healing miracle that, if you like, is a culmination of all of them. And he was sitting by the roadside. Oh, I do love the Bible, and I'm so grateful for Bible translators, but I wish they wouldn't confuse things. He was sitting by the road, by the way. It's the same word that's used as road and sometimes translated way. And would you believe at the end of verse 52, the end of the story, the same word is used. Immediately he regained his sight. There's a spoiler, but you knew that was going to happen. He regained his sight and followed him on the way. Same word, road. Why do the translators do this? I know English is a wonderful language and I love English and it's got lots of words for everything, but sometimes just reducing the vocabulary a little bit to translate more accurately and show that the same word is being used would give us a new insight. And here it most certainly does. He's by the side of the road. He's not on the road. He's not on the way of the cross. He's not on the way of discipleship. He's not on the way to Jerusalem at the beginning of the story. And at the end of the story, he is. At the end of the story, clearly he is a disciple. He's on the way. He's walking with Jesus. And that's the same word. He was beside the way. In other words, a spectator rather than a disciple. And he goes on to the way and walks it with Jesus. He becomes a disciple. I just wish, I wish something about translation, but I'm grateful for translators. He was sitting by the roadside when he heard it was Jesus of Nazareth. Now, not quite right. Jesus the Nazarene. There's a slightly different technical meaning, I think. I'd rather it called Jesus the Nazarene here rather than Jesus of Nazareth. That is used rather more rarely, I think only twice by Mark, the Nazarene. And it implies all sorts of things about someone's holiness rather than just where they've come from. Because the name of Nazareth, and you remember the Nazarite vow of Samson and all sorts of, and Paul does something similar. These names of places can have a deep meaning. And when someone is called of Nazareth, that would be the standard way of saying where they came from. When he's called the Nazarene, it just means something different. There's something different, I think, in English between someone who is from London and someone who is a Londoner. Now, I'm not from London or a Londoner, but I know that if someone says they're a Londoner, it means something about London's in my blood. It's who I am. It's not just where I happen to have come from most recently or whatever. It's in me. And here Jesus is the Nazarene, set aside Holy One. Something special about Nazarene. That's a different study. I'm only hinting at it now. When he heard it was Jesus the Nazarene, he began to shout out, Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me. Oh boy, Son of David. 2 Samuel chapter 7, the great promise to David that his son would sit, his descendant would sit on the throne forever, ruling over God's people. Son of David, not often used again either, but it's a deeply significant phrase for a Jew to be using. Jesus, Son of David, or even, and it's possible, a Gentile, Bartimaeus, probably Jewish, Jericho, little bit of a mixed place. Bartimaeus with that name, probably Jewish, but Son of David, that is very clear. The Messiah, the promised one, have mercy on me. Many sternly ordered him to be quiet, but he cried out even more loudly, Son of David, have mercy on me. Jesus stood still. The original Jesus stood. Something about this blind beggar sitting by the roadside, shouting out over the crowds trying to stop him, stops Jesus. Stock still, he stops. He hears it. Call him here, he says. And they called the blind man, saying, get up, he's calling you. Mark loves his symbolism. He keeps on doing it. We're told John is the one who does symbolism big in the Gospels. The more I've been studying Mark over recent weeks and months, the more I'm seeing it there too. Throwing off his cloak, he sprang up and came to Jesus. Throws off his cloak, leaves it behind. Just as the disciples left their nets behind when they followed Jesus, except they didn't really, because they weren't quite wholehearted and they hadn't quite got it in the following of Jesus, as we've discovered in recent weeks. They still had to learn. Following Jesus means working out who Jesus is and walking with him, seeing clearly who Jesus is. And when we see who he is, we'll throw off our cloak and everything else. The cloak was the sole possession of the poor. That explained in the Old Testament a number of times. It's a garment to keep you warm or shaded in the day. It's the garment that goes over you. It's your blanket at night. It's your possessions, everything. He throws aside everything and sprang up and came to Jesus. And Jesus said an unusual sentence, unusual construction, and not the normal way of putting it. What do you want me to do for you? I wonder if the disciples were listening. Well, of course they were, because it's recorded. I wonder if James and John were listening, because it's exactly what he'd asked James and John in the previous passage. What do you want me to do for you? And what they wanted was glory and honor and sitting at his right and left on his throne. They wanted fame, fortune, glory, honor. Bartimaeus said, my teacher, let me see again. My teacher is a stronger word than the normal rabbi teacher. It's Rabboni, which you may remember from John chapter 20. Mary Magdalene calls the risen Jesus Rabboni. That's the only other time it occurs in the New Testament. Bartimaeus is putting himself in a very special place with regard to Jesus, not on his right or his left, not on a throne next to him, without obviously knowing about Mary Magdalene, and her story is yet to come anyway. It's only a week later, but without knowing Mary Magdalene, Bartimaeus uses the same unusual title for Jesus, my teacher, which means I think I'm committed to following you. You're not just a teacher who I honor as a teacher and use the title rabbi because that's an honorific, as we would say. That's a respectful way to address a religious teacher in the Jewish world. Rabbi, Rabboni, is very personal. It's not in the sense of being impertinent. It's very personal because it denotes a deep commitment to the teacher and to the teacher's teaching. Rabboni means you're my teacher and I'm yours. I follow you. I'm with you. I belong to you. Lock, stock and barrel. I've thrown my cloak. I've gone. I'm yours. I'm yours, Jesus. Let me see again. The disciples couldn't see. Even James and John, leading disciples, the bigwigs, the ones who'd been up on the Mount of Transfiguration with Jesus. Even the inner core, the inner cabinet of the apostles couldn't see. Well, they saw vaguely. They knew Jesus was the King and the Lord. They got that, but they didn't know what that meant. They couldn't see clearly. They were like the man healed in Bethsaida the first time, touched by Jesus, but still couldn't see fully, properly, clearly. The disciples were the same. And yet here's this man who's blind, a beggar, not on the road, not on the way of discipleship, but he knows that Jesus is the Son of David, the promised one. Somehow he knows that he needs to follow him. What do you want me to do for you? The man says, my teacher, let me see again. My teacher, I'm following you. Let me see. In some ways, as blind, he can already see far better than the disciples, but there's more to come. Jesus says to him, go, your faith has made you well. It's a lovely little bit of irony or power going to happen now. Go, your faith has made you well. One Bible preacher has said James and John, when asked what they wanted from Jesus, wanted fame, and this man, when asked, wanted faith. Jesus said, go, your faith has made you well. Go. Immediately he regained his sight and followed him on the way, on that road, on the way to Jerusalem. He is now sold out for Jesus. He's committed to him. He'll walk the way of the cross with Jesus. He'll walk that way to Jerusalem. He's not seeking any wealth or honor or glory or anything. We're given his name because it's so important that we remember this story and this man. But he's not given anything except to see again. Somehow, it wasn't that he hadn't seen before, that he'd been blind from birth. Somehow he'd lost his sight. And he just asked for a restoration of who he is as a human being. I just want to be a complete human being and to give you my whole life and follow you with all that I am. And he regained his sight and followed him on the way. Jesus says, go, you're better, your faith's made you well, you can go. And he doesn't go, he comes. He joins Jesus on the way because he is sold out as a disciple and a follower of Jesus. And that, although the disciples don't come into it, is the real culmination of this intensive discipleship training. He is the example for us to remember. Now, of course, the names of the disciples, particularly the key ones, the ones who get much of a mention in this part of Mark's Gospel, are well known and will be well known in the Christian world and sometimes even outside it. Peter, James, and John, in different ways, for different reasons. James, the focus of so much discipleship, pilgrimage, Santiago de Compostela, all that stuff, very important history of pilgrimage for the Christian church, often focused on James. John, the author of some of the most beloved writings in the Christian world particularly the Gospel and his letters, such depth and wonder and thoughtfulness and astonishing power of writing and clarity of explaining. And Peter, the great leader of the disciples, sometimes his mouth's a bit big and he puts his foot in it, but Jesus is clearly, Peter is clearly seen as the leader, and in Roman Catholic thinking he is the first pope, but generally, historically understood to have been the first real named leader of the church in Rome. Peter, James, John, these three at the heart of the band of apostles, the three who saw Jesus on the Mount of Transfiguration. They're the names who we remember. Who are the disciples? Who are the apostles? They're the three who get named first. But here's the hero. Is that the word? Jesus is the hero, but he's a different sort of hero because he's going to give his life as a ransom. Here's the one who's understood discipleship as Jesus is training discipleship, and his name is Bartimaeus. And we give him the name for a reason, because in Jesus' very last stage of his journey to Jerusalem, one more walk to do up that hill through the hot sun of that dangerous mountain desert path. Jesus is going to walk to Jerusalem and to his betrayal and sufferings and torture and death. And he's preparing his disciples for that, and his disciples still want to know what they'll get out of it. And Bartimaeus says, I just want to walk with you. Throw everything off. Don't need anything else except to be with you on the way as your disciple. Go, your faith has made you well, says Jesus. You're okay. Made you well. It's the same word in Greek as saved you. It's a deep inner healing, peace, salvation, something permanent. He's recognized Jesus as the Son of David, the promised Messiah, the one who can heal him. He's acknowledged him as my teacher. I'm following your teaching for always. But he goes further when Jesus says, go, your faith has made you well. He doesn't just follow Jesus' teaching, he follows Jesus on the way, on the road, the way to Jerusalem. May we recognize and know and follow Jesus' teaching, but much more, may we recognize and know and follow Jesus. Amen.